I never would have thought my life could change so drastically, and in such a short span of time too. My name's Sarah, I'm 25 years old, and up until recently, I believed I had a pretty ordinary life. I was married to Luke, my college love, and we shared a cozy apartment right in downtown Chicago. We both had stable jobs, hung out with friends on the weekends, and were even planning to start a family in the near future. Everything seemed to be right on track, until Mark came into the picture. Mark is my younger adopted half-brother. My parents took him in when I was 15 and he was just 10 years old. Growing up, we were never particularly close, mostly because I was going through that rebellious teenage phase, and the last thing I wanted was a little brother tagging along. Plus, not long after he moved in, I left for college out of state. Our time together was pretty limited to family holidays like Christmas or the occasional birthday. But everything shifted about 6 months ago when Mark called me asking for a favor. He had landed an internship with a big company in the city and needed a place to stay for a few months while he searched for his own apartment. Without giving it much thought, I offered him our guest room. Luke agreed, though I did pick up on a bit of hesitation in his voice when I brought it up. The day Mark showed up with his bags, I was genuinely taken aback by how much he had changed. He wasn't the shy, quiet kid I remembered. He was now an attractive and confident young man. His green eyes sparkled with excitement as he talked about his plans and dreams for the future. I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride at how far he'd come. The first few weeks were a little awkward. Mark and I were practically strangers living under the same roof. We'd pass each other in the kitchen in the mornings, exchange a few polite words during dinner, but that was about it. Luke was busy with work, and even when he was home, he'd lock himself in his study to focus on projects. However, over time Mark and I started to find some common ground. We discovered a shared love for sci-fi series and started watching them together in the evenings. I was surprised at how easily we could talk, how often he made me laugh with his clever remarks, and how thoughtful he was when it came to the little things. One night, as we were finishing the season finale of our favorite show, Mark asked me about my marriage with Luke. It was the first time anyone had really asked me that, and I found myself being completely honest. "Things are fine," I said, hesitating a little. "Luke is a good guy. He takes care of me, respects me, but sometimes it feels like we're drifting apart. He's so wrapped up in his career and I guess I'm looking for something more in life, though I don't really know what that is." Mark gave me a look so intense that I felt a bit exposed, vulnerable even. "You deserve to be happy, Sarah," he said softly. "You shouldn't just settle for something that's fine." His words echoed in my mind for days afterward. I started picking up on things I hadn't really noticed before. How Luke barely made eye contact when we spoke, how our conversations were often shallow, how it had been a while since I felt that thrill when he came home from work. Meanwhile, my relationship with Mark continued to grow. We started spending more and more time together, not just watching shows but cooking meals, going for morning runs, or staying up late just talking. I found myself looking forward to those moments, waiting for him to come back from work, making excuses to be around him. Then one afternoon while we were making dinner together, our hands accidentally brushed as we reached for the same spatula. I felt this surge of energy ripple through me, and when I looked up at him, I saw the same thing reflected in his eyes. It was brief, but it was enough to make me realize that something between us was starting to shift. I did everything I could to brush off the feelings, telling myself it was just a symptom of the boredom in my marriage, or the excitement of having someone new around the house. But every day it became harder and harder to ignore the connection Mark and I shared. Things took a turn for the worse when the air conditioner in Mark's room decided to quit. It was the middle of summer, and the heat was unbearable. Without thinking it through too much, I offered for him to stay in our room since Luke was away on a business trip. "I don't want to make things awkward for you," Mark said, looking visibly uncomfortable. "Don't be ridiculous," I answered, forcing a smile, though I could feel my own nerves creeping in. "We're family, aren't we?" That night, lying in bed with Mark just a few feet away, it felt like the air in the room was charged with electricity. I could hear his breathing, feel the warmth radiating from his body. I lay there wide awake for hours, battling the urge to move closer to him, to reach out and touch him. The days that followed were like sweet torture. The physical closeness only made it harder to push down the feelings I had been fighting. I started noticing how Mark's gaze would linger on me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, how he'd find subtle ways to brush against my hand or arm. One evening, while we were watching a movie in the living room, the tension between us became almost unbearable. Without a word, Mark moved closer and gently took my hand. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel my breath coming quicker. Slowly, I turned to look at him and our eyes locked. I'm not sure who moved first, but suddenly we were kissing. It was a raw, desperate kiss, full of all the pent-up passion and desire we'd both been holding back. My fingers found their way into his hair, and he pulled me closer, erasing any space left between us. In that moment, nothing else mattered. I didn't think about Luke or the fact that Mark was my adopted brother, or the consequences of what we were doing. All I could focus on was the feeling of his lips on mine, his hands exploring my body. That night, we crossed a line we couldn't uncross. We made love with a kind of intensity one had never experienced before. Every touch, every kiss, every sound was drenched in the emotions we had been burying for so long. Afterward, as we lay in silence, the weight of what we had done hit me like a ton of bricks. Guilt and shame tangled with excitement and desire, leaving me overwhelmed by a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "This shouldn't have happened," I whispered, though it felt like I was saying it more to myself than to Mark. He looked at me with a mixture of pain and longing in his eyes. "I know," he said softly, "but I can't bring myself to regret it." The next few days were unbearable. We both tried to act like everything was normal, but the tension between us was impossible to ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch was loaded with meaning. When Luke came back from his trip, I felt like the worst kind of person as I kissed him on the cheek and asked about his trip. I tried to distance myself from Mark, throwing myself into work and making an effort to focus on my marriage. But it felt like I had opened a door that I couldn't close. My mind kept wandering back to him, replaying the moments we had shared, craving his touch. One night, after Luke had fallen asleep beside me, I quietly slipped out of bed and made my way to Mark's room. I found him sitting on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. When he looked up and saw me, his eyes were full of tears. "I can't keep doing this, Sarah," he said, his voice trembling. "I love you, but this is tearing us all apart." His words cut through me like a knife, because I loved him too with a force that scared me. But our love was causing so much hurt, so much destruction. "What are we supposed to do?" I asked, sitting down beside him and taking his hand. "I think I need to leave," he said quietly after a long pause. "Find a job in another city, start over somewhere new." The thought of Mark leaving felt like someone was physically tearing a part of me away. But deep down I knew he was right. Things couldn't go on like this and something had to change. "Are you really sure?" I asked, though deep down I already knew what his answer would be. Mark nodded slowly. "It's for the best," he said. "This way you can work on saving your marriage and maybe I can try to forget you. Though I'm not sure if I'll ever be able to." We sat there in silence for a long while, just holding each other's hands, thinking about the future we knew we could never have. Then, unable to hold back any longer, I kissed him. It was a kiss full of all the love and heartbreak we were feeling, knowing it might be our last. The next morning, Mark told Luke that he'd accepted a job offer in another city and would be moving in a week. Luke seemed surprised but genuinely happy for him, with no idea of the real reason behind Mark's sudden decision. The days that followed were pure agony. Every minute I spent with Mark felt both precious and painful. We did our best to act normal around Luke, but when we were alone we couldn't stop ourselves from seeking out each other's company, knowing that our time together was running out. The night before he was set to leave, while Luke was fast asleep, I snuck into Mark's room one last time. We didn't make love that night. Instead, we just held each other, crying quietly and whispering promises we knew we wouldn't be able to keep. The day of his departure came much too quickly. We helped him load his bags into the taxi, and Luke wished him luck at his new job. When it was my turn to say goodbye, my heart felt like it was shattering into pieces. Our hug lingered far longer than it should have, and I had to summon every bit of strength not to break down and sob right there. "I love you," Mark whispered softly in my ear before he let go. "I always will." And then he was gone. I stood there watching him climb into the taxi and drive off, feeling like a part of me went with him. The days and weeks that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt a guilty sense of relief that I no longer had to live with the constant tension and fear of being found out. On the other hand, Mark's absence left a hole in my life that nothing seemed to fill. Luke noticed my gloominess and chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. He made more of an effort to make me happy, which only made the guilt heavier. I tried to return his affection, convincing myself that I could fall in love with him again, that we could somehow rebuild what we had. But every night, as Luke slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about Mark. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, and if he thought about me as much as I thought about him. There were moments during my weakest times when I'd pick up my phone wanting to call him, but I always stopped myself at the last second. The months went by and life carried on. Luke and I settled into a comfortable routine, but the passion that had once existed between us was missing. I threw myself into work, trying to stay busy and avoid thinking about what I had lost. Then one afternoon, as I was going through the mail, I came across a letter from Mark. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized his handwriting on the envelope. With trembling hands, I opened it and began to read. Dear Sarah, I hope this letter finds you well. It's been 6 months since I left, and not a single day has gone by where I haven't thought about you. I know we promised not to reach out, but I needed to let you know that I'm okay, and that I hope you are too. My new job is challenging and it keeps me busy, which is a good thing because it stops me from constantly thinking about what I left behind. I've met new people and tried to move on, live a normal life, but the truth is nothing compares to what we had. I'm not writing this to disrupt your life or ask you to come back to me. I know we made the right decision no matter how painful it was. I just wanted to tell you that despite the time and distance, my feelings for you haven't changed. I hope you've found happiness, Sarah, because you deserve it more than anyone. And if fate ever brings us back together, I'll be waiting. With all my love, Mark. I read the letter again and again, tears rolling down my face. Every word echoed the truth that I, too, was feeling. No matter how hard I tried to move forward, to be the wife Luke deserved, my heart still belonged to Mark. That night, as Luke slept peacefully beside me, I came to a decision. I couldn't keep living this lie. It wasn't fair to Luke, to me, or to the love Mark and I shared. The next morning, with a heavy but resolved heart, I asked Luke if we could talk. The concern was clear in his eyes when I told him there was something important we needed to discuss. Luke, I began, my voice shaking just a little. There's something I need to tell you, something I should have been honest about a long time ago. And so, as the morning light filtered through the windows of our apartment, I laid everything out. I told him about my feelings for Mark, about our affair, about how we had tried to end it, and the guilt I had been carrying for months. Luke listened without interrupting, his face frozen in shock and pain. When I finally finished, he sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Why are you telling me this now? He asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Because I love you enough not to lie to you anymore, I answered, tears brimming in my eyes. Because you deserve the truth and the chance to be with someone who can love you fully. The next few days were filled with heartbreaking conversations, tears, and endless questions. Luke swung between anger, hurt, and desperation. He begged me to try again, to forget everything and start fresh. But I knew deep down that I couldn't. I couldn't keep living a lie, no matter how much I wanted to spare him from the pain. In the end, after what felt like an eternity of painful talks, Luke and I came to a mutual decision. We would get divorced. It was a difficult choice, but we both knew it was the only way forward. Our marriage had reached a point where saving it would only prolong our suffering. The divorce process was grueling, emotionally draining, and it felt like we were tearing our lives apart piece by piece. We had to explain everything to our family and friends. Many didn't understand and some harshly judged me for it. But to my surprise, I found support in places I hadn't expected. My best friend Lisa was shocked at first, but in the end she stood by me through it all. I won't say I agree with what you did, she told me one evening as we shared a bottle of wine. But I understand that sometimes the heart makes choices that the mind just can't control. Her words were like a soothing balm on my aching heart. They reminded me that despite my mistakes, there were still people who cared about me and had my back. When the divorce was finally finalized, it felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. There was pain, of course, and regret, but there was also a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in a long time. I spent the following months putting my life back together. I moved into a small apartment, focused on my career, and began the long process of rediscovering myself. Slowly but surely, I began to heal the wounds caused by my actions, both to myself and to others. Then one day, I found myself thinking about Mark, not with the same desperation and longing as before, but with a newfound clarity I hadn't had in a long time. I realized that despite everything, my feelings for him hadn't faded. With trembling hands, I picked up my phone and dialed his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times before I heard his familiar voice on the other end. "Sarah," he said, surprise and hope blending in his tone. "Mark," I replied, my heart pounding. "We need to talk." We agreed to meet at a cafe, somewhere halfway between our cities. When I saw him walk through the door, it felt like time had stood still. He was still the same Mark who had stolen my heart, but there was a new maturity in his eyes, a sign of all the experiences we had both been through. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us knew how to begin. There was so much to say, so many emotions that had been buried for so long. "I've missed you," Mark finally said, breaking the silence that had settled between us. "I've missed you too," I replied, feeling the sting of tears threatening to fall. "Every single day." And just like that, we started talking. I told him everything about my divorce, how I had come to realize that I couldn't keep ignoring my feelings for him. He told me about his new life, how he had tried to move on, but the memory of what we shared never truly left him. "What do we do now?" Mark asked after hours of conversation. I reached across the table and took his hand, feeling the warmth and comfort of his touch once again. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I do know that I want to figure it out with you." Mark smiled, the same smile that always made my heart race. "Me too," he said softly. We left the cafe hand in hand, unsure of what the future had in store for us, but certain of one thing. This time we were going to face it together. It wasn't going to be easy. We'd have to navigate the judgment from others, the complications of our family history, and our own fears and doubts. But as we walked under the afternoon sun, I felt a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. I knew the road ahead would be challenging, but I also knew that the love Mark and I shared was worth fighting for. Our story wasn't a conventional one. It was messy, full of mistakes, pain, and hard choices. But it was also filled with a love so deep and true. A love that had withstood time, distance, and all the obstacles life had thrown at us. As we walked away together, I didn't have a clear picture of what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever came our way, we would face it side by side. And that thought alone gave me the strength to move forward. Because isn't that what love is really about? Finding that one person who makes you feel like no matter what life throws at you, you can face it all together? Someone who gives you the confidence that, come what may, you can overcome anything as long as you have each other? Mark squeezed my hand and looked at me with those familiar green eyes I loved so much. And in that moment I knew we had made the right choice. No matter what lay ahead, we would face it together. Our story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. And I couldn't wait to see what the next chapter held for us.